There's a kind of disconnection that doesn't come from giving up or shutting down. It comes from something deeper pulling inward, as if your inner world has temporarily stepped back from the surface of your life. From the outside, it can look like distance, withdrawal, or indifference. From the inside, it feels more like suspension, a pause. The psyche does this when it's reorganizing, not when it's collapsing, but when it's preparing to redefine direction. Emotional failure feels sharp and heavy. This kind of disconnection feels confusing, quieter, harder to name. You still feel present, but not attached in the same way. The difference matters. Emotional shutdown is a collapse of feeling. This phase is a redistribution of energy. Something inside you is being rearranged, not erased, and the temporary distance is part of how that reorganization protects itself from interference. As this internal shift happens, the environments you've been emotionally living in can suddenly feel foreign. People you care about, places you know well, routines that once grounded you may start to feel oddly distant, as if you're slightly out of phase with them. Nothing dramatic has changed, yet the fit is gone. This happens when your inner self outgrows the emotional environment your body is still inhabiting. Growth creates distance before it creates movement. Before you leave physically, you leave emotionally. The discomfort here isn't rejection or resentment, it's misalignment. Staying begins to require effort where it once felt natural. You may try to force connection back into place, to reinsert yourself emotionally, but that effort only increases the emptiness. Forced connection drains because it asks you to invest energy into spaces that no longer reflect you. Disconnection appears not because you stopped caring, but because your inner world no longer belongs where you still are. At the same time, your nervous system may be doing something very specific and very misunderstood. After long exposure to stimulation, pressure, drama, or constant engagement, the body eventually pulls back. Overstimulation doesn't always lead to anxiety. Sometimes it leads to numbness. Not as a malfunction, but as protection. When the system has been asked to process too much for too long, it reduces input. Interest in noise fades. Drama loses its pull. Distraction stops working the way it used to. Silence begins to feel strange, even uncomfortable, because the system isn't used to it. But this withdrawal is not disconnection from life. It's the nervous system demanding a quieter reality so it can recalibrate. What feels like distance is often a boundary forming at a biological level. The body is saying it needs less intensity to function, and until that need is honored, emotional engagement naturally decreases. This pullback often coincides with identity dissolution, which is one of the loneliest phases of growth. When an old identity begins to dissolve, the new one doesn't appear immediately. There is a gap between versions of yourself, and inside that gap, many people feel disconnected from everything. Roles that once organized your sense of self lose their authority. You may no longer recognize what motivates you, what excites you, or how you fit into familiar dynamics. The fear that arises here is often the fear of not knowing who I am anymore. The ego interprets this as loss, because it depends on definition to feel safe. But identity transitions require this empty space. The old structure has to loosen before a new one can form. This phase is temporary, but essential. You feel disconnected not because you are disappearing, but because the version of you that maintained those connections has already ended. During this time, emotional detachment deepens, and it's easy to misread what's happening. Caring less about certain things does not mean you care about nothing. It means you're no longer emotionally entangled in the same automatic ways. You begin to notice space between stimulus and response. You don't react as quickly. You don't absorb as much. You don't personalize everything. This brings relief, but it can also feel unfamiliar if your identity was built around emotional intensity or responsiveness. Calm can feel empty when you're used to chaos. Stillness can feel like absence when you're used to constant engagement. But this detachment isn't coldness. It's clarity developing. It's your system learning how to experience without being consumed. Over time, this creates discernment. You don't lose feeling, you gain choice about where feeling goes. Another reason disconnection feels so pronounced is that you're no longer feeding the old emotional loops that once created a sense of connection. Repetition can create a false intimacy. Shared drama, shared stress, shared cycles of reaction can feel like closeness, even when they're unhealthy. When those loops break, something disappears. The intensity drops. The emotional noise quiets. And in the absence of that familiar charge, loneliness can surface. But this loneliness isn't evidence that something is missing. It's evidence that something repetitive has ended. Old patterns can no longer restart themselves because you're not supplying the same energy. This space is necessary. Without it, there's no room for healthier bonds to form. Disconnection here is the clearing left behind when old emotional machinery shuts down. All of this converges into a moment that's easy to misinterpret if you don't recognize it for what it is. You reach a threshold, the edge of a chapter, a place where you're no longer anchored to what you've outgrown, but not yet grounded in what's next. The mind wants to fix this feeling quickly, to diagnose it, to force reconnection, to restore familiarity. But doing that often pulls you backward into dynamics that no longer fit. This phase isn't asking to be fixed. It's asking to be respected, to be allowed to exist without being rushed or labeled as a problem. Disconnection here is not failure. It's transition. If you feel disconnected, it doesn't mean you're losing yourself. It means you're no longer anchored to what no longer aligns. The distance you feel is not emptiness. It's space. Space created by growth. Space created by nervous system recalibration. Space created by identity shedding. And that space is not the end of connection. It's the beginning of a different kind of connection. One that won't be built on old loops, old roles, or old survival patterns. Real change often begins not with clarity or excitement, but with this quiet, disorienting distance. The feeling that something has loosened, even if you can't yet see what will replace it. This is not disconnection from life. It's life reorganizing itself around a truer center. What tends to surface in this phase is a quiet noticing of how much effort used to go into staying emotionally connected to things that no longer nourish you. You may begin to see, almost with surprise, how often connection was maintained through obligation, habit, or unspoken contracts rather than genuine resonance. When that realization lands, the psyche naturally pulls back, not as punishment and not as withdrawal from life, but as a correction. Energy stops flowing automatically into places where it was being spent out of inertia rather than truth. This is why the disconnection can feel confusing. Nothing external demands distance, yet something internal refuses to keep investing. The pull inward is not avoidance. It is discernment awakening before you have words for it. In that inward pull, you may also notice how much noise used to fill your emotional landscape. Constant input, constant processing, constant reaction. When the nervous system finally decides it has had enough, it doesn't negotiate. It simply reduces signal. Drama stops registering. Excessive stimulation feels draining instead of exciting. Even conversations that revolve around repetition rather than presence begin to feel heavy. Silence, which once felt uncomfortable, starts to feel necessary. At first, this quieter state can feel like loss, because intensity has been mistaken for aliveness. But intensity is not the same as depth. Often, it was a way to stay activated so you wouldn't have to feel how misaligned things had become. The nervous system pullback is not a rejection of life. It's a recalibration of how much life you can honestly process without fragmenting yourself. As this quieter reality takes hold, isolation can appear, not because you are truly alone, but because you are no longer syncing with emotional environments that run on outdated frequencies. You may find yourself physically present but emotionally absent, observing rather than participating. This can trigger guilt, confusion, or fear that you're becoming disconnected from people you care about. But care doesn't always look like engagement. Sometimes care looks like honesty with yourself about what you can no longer sustain. Emotional presence without authenticity eventually becomes self-betrayal. The psyche knows this, even when the mind resists it. So it creates distance, not to punish you, but to stop the slow erosion that comes from staying too long where you no longer belong. This distance often sharpens during identity transitions. When the old identity dissolves, you temporarily lose the relational roles that once told you how to connect. You're no longer the same version of yourself in conversations, dynamics, or expectations. Without that script, connection feels awkward or incomplete. You might not know how to show up the way you used to, and forcing it feels hollow. This can feel isolating, because the old ways of being with others are gone, and the new ways haven't stabilized yet. But this gap is not emptiness, it's recalibration. It's the psyche clearing out relational habits that were built around who you were, so new forms of connection can emerge that match who you're becoming. One of the most unsettling parts of this phase is realizing that emotional detachment can coexist with compassion. You may still understand people, empathize with them, wish them well, and yet feel no impulse to stay entangled in their emotional worlds. This is often misinterpreted as coldness, especially if you were once highly reactive, responsive, or emotionally involved. But detachment here is not the absence of care, it's the absence of compulsion. You're no longer pulled into dynamics automatically. You have space to choose. That choice can feel strange at first, because it disrupts patterns that once defined intimacy. But over time, this space becomes the foundation for healthier, cleaner connection that doesn't require self-sacrifice to maintain. As old emotional loops lose their grip, the sense of connection they once provided disappears with them. Shared stress, shared struggle, shared cycles of reaction often masquerade as closeness. When those loops break, the emotional charge drops, and what's left can feel like a void. But this void is not evidence that you've lost connection. It's evidence that connection is no longer being generated by repetition. The loneliness that appears here is transitional. It's the quiet after a machine stops running. And in that quiet, something more honest has a chance to form. Without the old loops, you're no longer bonded through survival patterns. You're waiting for bonds that can exist without them. This is why trying to fix disconnection too quickly tends to backfire. When you rush to reconnect just to escape discomfort, you often reattach to what you've already outgrown. The mind wants familiarity, not truth. It wants to feel anchored, even if the anchor keeps you in shallow water. But this phase is not asking you to reconnect indiscriminately. It's asking you to notice what no longer holds, to tolerate the gap without immediately filling it, to let the nervous system complete its withdrawal so it can later re-engage from a healthier place. Disconnection here is not the opposite of connection. It's the reset that makes real connection possible. Over time, subtle shifts begin to emerge. You may notice a clearer sense of what drains you versus what nourishes you. A quieter confidence in stepping back without explanation. A growing comfort with fewer but more honest interactions. These changes don't announce themselves as breakthroughs. They feel almost anticlimactic. But they signal that the reorganization is working. The psyche is building a new orientation, one that doesn't rely on constant emotional output to feel real. You're learning to exist without being perpetually plugged into external feedback. Eventually, this phase reveals its true nature. What you thought was disconnection was actually a threshold, a point where the old ways of relating could no longer continue, and new ways had not yet fully formed. The danger was never the distance itself, but the temptation to panic and run back to familiarity. If you stay present long enough, the space begins to feel less empty and more open. Less like loss, more like possibility. Not loud possibility, not exciting possibility, but clean possibility. If you're here now, feeling distant, quieter, less emotionally hooked, it doesn't mean you're withdrawing from life. It means life is reorganizing how it moves through you. The anchors you relied on are loosening because they've done their job. The old emotional machinery is powering down so something more coherent can take its place. This is not the end of connection. It's the end of connection built on outdated patterns. And while this threshold can feel lonely, it carries a quiet promise. What comes next will not require you to abandon yourself to belong.